All right, our final speaker for this morning is Cory Arnold. Cory writes, directs, animates, and produces the educational YouTube series, 12 Tone. His work, covering a wide range of topics under the umbrella of music theory, has gathered over 135,000 subscribers, and his weekly videos have, over the last 3 years, been viewed almost 5 million times. His presentation is titled Communicating Music Theory in Online Video. Welcome, Cory.
Thank you. All right, so I figured it'd be good to start with a couple questions, get a sense of where y'all are at. So if I could get a show of hands, how many of you regularly watch online videos, be it YouTube, Facebook, Instagram? All right, cool. Those of you who raise your hands there, how many of you regularly watch online educational videos? Awesome. If you didn't, you're missing out. But for those of you who did, how many of you regularly watch online educational videos about music? Cool, yeah, I expected similar hands there. And last question for the sake of my ego, how many of you regularly watch online educational videos about music from the YouTube channel 12 Tone? All right, awesome. So, I don't think there's a huge amount of point in me standing up here and telling you all how to teach music, because I suspect many of you have a better idea of that than I do. So I'd like to focus instead on some of the specific problems faced when doing it through the medium of online video. Or to put that in the form of a snappy title, I want to talk about why YouTube is not a classroom. And in order to do that, we first have to ask, what is the point of a classroom? From a pedagogical perspective, what do you gain from working in a traditional classroom setting? And the answer, as I'm sure you're aware, is a lot of things, but for the sake of time, I'm going to boil it down to two main points: consistency and captivation. So consistency is the idea that you have the same students class after class and week after week. You get to walk them through an entire syllabus over the course of a semester, and then you get to start again with a new batch. And even in that first class where you may have never met any of your students before, you still have a pretty good idea what they know. It's enough to meet any prerequisites, but it's not enough to test out. And I'm positive it doesn't seem like they're all at the same level, but compare that to my audience. When someone clicks on one of my videos for the first time, they could be a guitarist or a teenager who just picked up guitar, or, as we saw, they could be the sort of person who attends academic conferences on music discourse. My 13-year-old cousin watches my videos, as do numerous college professors with more advanced degrees than I have, and whoever you are, I need to quickly and clearly convince you that you're going to learn something new. But I'll get back to that in a minute. First, I want to focus on the problem of knowledge bases. If any video of mine could be your first, I can't assume that you know basically anything, even if I've explained it 100 times before. I have to start from scratch every time, or at least as close as I can without reinventing the universe. I can't begin every video by explaining how notes work, but what I can do is set a baseline set of assumptions for what my audience knows, and I can keep that line consistent and above all, low. For my work, I just assume they know three things: notes, chords, and scales. I assume they know what they are, and I assume they know basic examples of them, but I don't really assume they know anything specific about those examples. If I want to mention a major triad, I can probably do that without ruffling too many feathers, but if I needed to know the specific structure of it, like that it's a major third and a minor third stacked on top of each other, I'll take the time to spell that out too. That's obviously a lot of explaining, and my videos are like 5 to 10 minutes long, so how do I find the time to talk about the actual interesting topics I'm trying to cover? Well, that's where my second tip comes in, and this I think applies to any educator no matter what medium you're working in. Develop short, clear explanations for common topics. And I mean short. Aim for one sentence, maximum of 2, and don't use any other vocabulary words. A good example from my work would be functional harmony. As you can imagine, this comes up a lot, and whenever it does, I just tell my audience that it's the idea that different chords in a key have different functions or jobs to do. Now, is that a complete explanation of functional harmony? No, of course not. Could you take it and go to real functional analysis? Not at all, but it gives you the tools you need in order to contextualize my main points. And if I needed to know anything specific about it, again, I'll take the time to spell that out too. There's also one specific phrase I want to introduce to the vocabulary of anyone doing online educational video. Something called. It's literally magic. You can slap it in front of any vocabulary word you want, and it immediately lets your audience know that it's okay if they don't know what it means yet, because you're about to explain it. You can slip a lot of really complicated ideas past people if you take the time to let them know that it's fine if they don't know it yet. And it's also short and clear enough that it doesn't tend to bother people who already know the thing, so I recommend using this phrase and others like it as liberally as possible. It's amazing how well it works. Anyway, the overall point here is best summarized by one of my favorite quotes from YouTuber CGP Grey. Overestimate your audience's intelligence, underestimate their vocabulary. Or to put that another way, assume your audience assume your audience is at least as smart as you, but doesn't know any of the things you know. Your job isn't to replace an entire college course in 5 minutes. That's impossible. You just need to give them the tools they need in order to understand your main points, and you need to do it fast. Why? Well, that brings me to the second benefit of a classroom, captivation. In a nutshell, this is the idea that your students want to be there. I mean, trust me, it may not be fun for them, but they have some reason, some external motivation. Maybe they need the class to graduate, or maybe they need a good grade for their GPA, or maybe they just find the subject fascinating and they don't really care who's teaching it. But the point is that most students in your classroom are going to have some reason to pay attention, even if you're not being all that interesting. And that may sound like a criticism, but I promise you it's not. The ability to be boring is a really, really valuable pedagogical tool. Study after study has shown that 2 of the most important techniques for fostering mastery are repetition and challenge. In effect, if you're not repeating yourself or making your students work hard, odds are good they're not really learning much. But the problem is that repetition is boring and challenge is frustrating, so if your students don't have any other reason to be there, they're just going to leave. The traditional classroom setting prevents that and forces them to engage with the material whether they want to or not, but on YouTube, I don't have that. Sorry. On YouTube, what I have is a custom curated sidebar full of videos that the algorithm thinks you would rather be watching than mine. If my work gets boring even for a second, your eyes will start to wander and bam, it's a panda. It doesn't matter how good my video gets after that. Once you see the panda, I've lost you. It's over. So if I want to teach you anything, I can't let that happen ever. Seriously, write this down. Never let your audience see the panda. Cool? All right, this is one of the reasons that I talk so fast in my video, although as you can probably tell, it's not the only reason. But I don't want to give my audience time to think ahead of me because while they're waiting for me to catch up, their eyes will start to wander. I try to make sure there's always something happening both audibly and visually so they never have any reason to get distracted. Of course, obviously, if I talk too fast, I run the risk of losing people who just can't keep up. But YouTube does let users slow videos down, and in the long run, I think that trade-off is worthwhile. But this is ignoring a larger problem. If repetition and challenge are the keys to mastery, and I can't repeat myself or make my audience work without just losing them, how do I actually teach them anything? How can I call myself an educator if I don't have access to some of the most important educational tools? Well, this is where this talk gets a little bit philosophical, but I think this comes down to a question about the purpose of education, and to be perfectly frank, I don't think mastery is the only valid goal. That's, of course, not to say it's not important, and I wouldn't argue that my work is a good replacement for a college course either. Just like their rules don't all really apply to me, my rules don't all apply to them. In any pedagogical setting, you need to optimize your tools in order to meet your goals, but I would argue that you also have to optimize your goals in order to best utilize your tools. YouTube isn't the place for fostering real deep mastery, so I don't really try. Instead, I set 5 different goals for myself, which I remember with the charming nonsense acronym ATWA: Appreciation, Inspiration, Direction, Utility, and Advocacy. These all boil down to some form of pointing at a thing and saying, hey, look how cool this thing is, but at different levels and for different audiences. Let's start with appreciation. This is for casual music lovers and self-taught musicians, and the goal is just to show you a different way of thinking about music. A good example of appreciation-heavy videos in our work is our song analyses, where I take a popular song and break down its harmony and other compositional elements in order to give you some explanation for why it feels the way it does. We don't tend to go too far in depth on any one topic in these videos. That's not really the point. The point is just to let you walk away with a deeper appreciation of some of your favorite songs and hopefully a bit more respect for what theorists do. Inspiration is similar, but instead of trying to convince you that theorists are cool, I'm trying to convince you that you might want to be one too. These videos are a bit more in-depth, and they're often structured kind of like a journey. For instance, in our video, How to Modulate Anywhere, I built the entire thing around a homework assignment I got in college to write a piece that modulated from D to A flat. I started by explaining why that was hard, and then I worked through more and more advanced techniques until I ended with a couple that actually worked, like tritone substitutions, chain modulations, and diminished sevenths. The point of these videos is to show you how a theorist, or at least how this theorist, might go about thinking through these sorts of problems, so you can decide if maybe it's something you might want to do as well. Moving on, we come to direction, which is for, well, you folks. This is where I take an esoteric, obscure topic and just sort of dive into it for a little bit, hopefully encouraging you to go do some research on your own afterwards. One of my favorites of these is a video we did called The Broken Scales of Wendy Carlos, where we looked at some work she'd done on non-octave repeating systems of tuning. It was so much fun to research, and by making the video, I was hoping to turn some other people onto it so they could go learn more about her and her work or experiment with the scales in their own time. These videos are often a little less general appeal because they're a little less clearly applicable, but they still serve an important purpose. They let your audience know that you know the hard stuff, so they can probably trust you with the easy stuff too. Plus, if I'm being honest, they're the most fun. Next up, we come to utility, which is just that, utility. This is actual practical advice that you can use in songwriting. And honestly, I don't tend to do this very often these days because, to be frank, I don't think helping with songwriting is the point of music theory, but it's certainly something it's good at, and every once in a while I'll make something like our 3 tips for writing a great melody. In these sorts of videos, simplicity and clarity are even more important. I'm not giving you a whole college course on melody writing. I'm just giving you a couple tools you might want to use if your melodies aren't working. These sorts of videos only want to have a couple main takeaways, and you want it to be really, really clear what they are. And finally, we come to advocacy. This is sort of the least fun of them because it's about defending the field from people who already dislike it, which may or may not be necessary depending on your specific area of expertise, but as I'm sure many of you are aware, the existence of music theory is annoyingly controversial among musicians. I can't tell you the last time a day went by without someone telling me that Chris Cornell or Kurt Cobain, or in at least one case, professional film composer John Williams didn't care about theory and just played what sounded good on his orchestra, and that analyzing the work from that perspective was an insult or at least missed the point. They also often use fairly colorful language as well, so if you're not used to that level of toxicity, that's something to be aware of if you get into this. But anyway, these videos tend to be a bit more philosophical. They're not really talking about a specific theoretical subject, but about theory itself. Our most recent one examined the question, can music be bad? And unexpectedly, the comment section was full of people saying, yes, of course it can, because here's a song I don't like, which that's another thing to be aware of. Not everyone is going to bother watching your video before they respond either. I'm not actually sure how effective any of these videos are at changing anyone's minds, but I still think they're important questions to ask, and having these sorts of conversations gives us a better understanding of the value of our own work. So in a nutshell, the main reason people who learn from my videos don't tend to do it in just the 5 minutes it takes to watch one. They do it because it inspires them to go do more research on their own time or experiment with the concepts in their work. My work is best viewed as sort of a guide for self-directed learning, and my audience is anyone who enjoys learning for its own sake, whether they're a musician or not. And of course, it's worth noting that while I do break my videos up into these 5 categories, everything I do is really some mix of all 5. You can be inspired by a more directional video, or you can appreciate the philosophy of an advocacy video, even if you don't actually disagree with me. And of course, also, depending on your specific area of expertise and who your target audience is, your goals might be completely different. My point here is just that you should know what they are so that you can make sure that you're meeting them. So that's why I do what I do, but how do you do it? How do you go about starting something like this? Where do you even begin? Well, fortunately for us, video making is an art form, and we're musicians. We know how to get good at art. You just copy the people who already are. I mean, that's not literally, obviously, but if you want to get good at soloing in jazz, the best way to do that isn't just to get up there and wing it, it's to listen to people like Coltrane, Davis, Armstrong. You want to write symphonies? There's Mozart, Beethoven, Bach. You want to make educational videos? Vsauce, Minute Physics, Weihart, Numberphile, CGP Grey. It doesn't have to be those specific creators, but the point is that the masters of the form are already out there, and if you want to become one, the best way to do that is to watch what they're doing, figure out which ones you like, figure out why you like them, and then incorporate that into your own work. For instance, my videos, like Becky's, are sort of like top-down, sped-up hand-drawn animation. And obviously, neither of us invented that style. As she mentioned, she was inspired by Weihart, so was I. I also credit a lot of my stuff to Minute Physics as well. But I've added my own sort of aesthetic spins, but it's clearly based on their content. And it doesn't have to be that obvious either. The way I structure information is very much based on channels like SciShow. I am, in effect, a student of online educational videos. I watch a wide variety of channels, both big and small, and a wide variety of subjects. And I try to watch at least a half an hour a day, although often it's an hour or two at least. And of course, I love the information I get from these videos. I love learning. But that's not the only reason I watch. I'm also studying them, watching for techniques that I might want to use myself, or perhaps more importantly, things I might want to avoid. But if I had to summarize everything I've learned into one word, it'd have to be personality. Your viewers don't want, you can't just upload a dry lecture to YouTube and expect it to do well. That's not how the platform works. Your audience doesn't just want to learn, they want to learn from you, and it's up to you to figure out why. What do you bring to the table that no one else does? For instance, I know of 5 currently active music theory channels that have over 100,000 subscribers each. There's me, Adam Neely, Rick Beato, 8-Bit Music Theory, and Holistic Songwriting. And I promise you, it would be literally impossible to confuse any of our work for any of the others. We all have very different production styles, different energies, different presentations, and we just do a lot of things completely differently. But more than the look, your voice comes across in what topics you cover and how you choose to talk about them. For instance, I love tuning. I've made a lot of videos about tuning systems, the harmonic series, and the mathematics of sound, not because it's the right thing to teach, but because I love talking about it. No other major music theory channel has made nearly as many videos about tuning as I have, because they're each focused on their own pet subjects. And none of those choices are better or worse than any of the others, but they're all the right choices for those creators because they let us showcase our passions. They let us show that we're actual people and we have real interests. I once mentioned in one of my videos, for instance, that I didn't go to college to be a music theorist. I went to be a metal singer, and my audience loved that because it let them see me as a more complete human. So it's easy to think of academics as kind of like faceless vessels of knowledge. Like we're all the same, we all know the same set of things, and if you ask us questions, we'll answer them. But we're not. We each have our own personalities, we each have our own interests and emotions, and the more you let that shine through, the more you let your audience see you as that sort of whole, complete person, the more they'll connect and the better they'll learn. You're not working from a syllabus or anything, it's YouTube, or at least, honestly, I don't think you should be, but your goal isn't mastery, it's passion. And that's, I think, most of what I wanted to say, but before I get to the Q&A, I did want to quickly mention a couple things I'm working on that some of you people might want to get involved in. I don't know if this sort of plugging is a thing at academic conferences, but I'm from the social media world and I promise I'll keep it quick. So while I was here at the conference, I was gonna shoot a video, some short interviews, 30-second elevator pitch for what you're working on to put together into something to show people sort of what an academic musician does. Because I think it's not a term a lot of people are familiar with, and I think a lot of people would think we're just like normal musicians, but smarter somehow. And I wanted to sort of show people maybe what research is being done in the field, and so yeah, if you want to be a part of that, I'll be wandering around during the breaks with the camera. Just find me. I'm wearing this scarf. It's not hard. The other thing is a little more in depth over on Twitter. I'm setting up what's called a rotating curation account, where every week a different music educator is going to take over and host and lead discussions about music, music pedagogy, music education, music academia, or whatever other music-related topics you want. It might be a good way to test out, dip your toe into the waters of communicating music with an online audience. And if any of you would like to be a part of that, just send me an email at 12tonevideos@gmail.com, and I'll send you a link to the application. And that's pretty much it, so let's get to the Q&A. Cool.
Thank you. Questions? Again, if you're new to the room, since this is streaming, I will ask that you use the mic.
Thank you for your presentation, Cory. So you mentioned that you went to school to be a metal singer.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, how did you get to music theory for creating such robust content for music theory teachers?
So honestly, I was doing just an associate's vocal performance program, just sort of get in there, meet some people, and start performing. And when I was doing that, I fell in love with the idea of teaching in general, and I was going to be just a vocal teacher. And I'd been doing well in theory classes at that point. I tested out of the first couple levels and was just doing well in that and enjoying it, but I hadn't really been focusing on it. And then I decided to get a more advanced degree. I decided to get a bachelor's, and that, I think, was where I really, once we started doing 4-part writing, those sorts of things, that's where I really fell in love with it, was just seeing not just the ideas, but how they became art, I guess. I don't know if that makes any sense, but just sort of understanding that not only was the music itself beautiful, but that the structures underneath it, that there was beauty in that too. And that, I think, was what really got me excited about theory. And then I was looking at, like, maybe I can just go be a theory professor. And then I started making videos and wound up doing that instead. So yeah.
Hi, I have a comment. Okay. As a student myself, I have trouble sometimes staying focused, and I go to YouTube sometimes for music theory. I've seen that there are videos that are 20 or 30 minutes long. They're very dreary and over-explaining much, and I can appreciate that you say your videos are shorter and more simple, yet knowledgeable for non-music majors to understand, or people who don't understand the value of music. Because it's always important to show that there are videos that are more in-depth in the process of music, but not making it too hard to understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the big things when making really any sort of video, but especially educational video, is that it can be easy to underestimate the value of editing. It can be easy to underestimate the value of, like, sort of taking out the parts that you don't need. Like, I did a video a while back on interval vectors, which is a music set theory thing. It's not really important what it is, but I sort of was trying to do research, and I found a video to watch that was like 6 minutes long, and I was like, oh, this is gonna have some good information. I'll learn some stuff, and I watched the entire thing. I wound up speeding it up, but I watched the entire thing, and it was 6 minutes of calculating one interval vector. And like, I understand that takes work. It takes time to do, and you have to, when you're calculating it, you do want to spend that time, and you want to make sure you're doing it right, and you want to figure out and make sure you understand what you're doing. But when you're explaining it, it can be easy to over-include that sort of thing, and just sort of be like, okay, I want to, but I can just be like, I can show you a calculated interval vector in maybe 10 seconds. It may take me longer to figure it out, or to figure out what it means, but I can instead, losing my train of thought, but yes, I completely agree with you, is I think my main point.
Thanks so much for your talk, and I'm a big fan of your channel.
Thank you.
And I was thinking about the kind of like meta music theory videos that you sometimes do, like why do music theory?
Yeah.
And I guess just wondering, why do you think music theory is so polarizing? And why do you think you have to answer the question, why do music theory?
So I think the big thing that I think often gets in the way is the idea, or the myth of divine inspiration, effectively. I think that we like to think of artists as getting their brilliant ideas out of the blue, and just like, oh my God, I'd never thought of that. Now I just sit down at a guitar for 5 minutes and I have the most beautiful song ever written. That's, of course, very rarely how it works, but it's a very romantic and very compelling narrative. And I think that winds up drawing people in. I'm sorry. While I was talking, I thought of a thing that I wanted to mention and then forgot it. But yeah, I think, like I said, it's very easy to get sold on the idea that people who make music are isolated geniuses who don't bother. Like I said, a lot of my videos get comments being like, oh, Kurt Cobain doesn't know music theory, so why would you look at his work from a theoretical perspective? And it's like, well, he never took music theory, but he spent a lot of time studying musicians. Like, that was a huge part of his life, was learning to play Jimi Hendrix, learning to play, like, also, and taking that, he didn't just wake up one day being like, oh, I just thought of Smells Like Teen Spirit. That's not how any of this, or not how it works. There's a lot of work that goes into it that we don't like to see, and music theory lays a lot of that bare, I think. And so people get annoyed sometimes. But what can you do, you know? Yeah.
We have time left for probably 2 more questions.
Thank you for your presentation. you mentioned interval vectors, and that's actually the last topic I made a video for. And I think I spent 2 months thinking about how the heck I was going to explain them in a way that was short, because it's not really a difficult concept, but it's difficult to explain.
Yeah.
Which is dumb. But, so I was wondering, like, for the topics, like, I did keep my video less than 6 minutes, which was my goal, and I covered a couple other things in that time period, which I was very proud of, but I'm just curious for the more complex topics that are sometimes difficult to explain, like, how do you approach, or how long does it take you to figure out how to condense it and make it clear and concise and quick?
I mean, in terms of how long it takes me, it varies. Because I keep a weekly upload schedule, my script writing process is generally not that long. I usually do research and start thinking about frameworks over the weekend and then write the actual script on like Monday and then do the rest of the production throughout the week. So in terms of how long it takes me, I don't know, I've also had a lot of practice at this point. But in terms of how I tend to approach it, the big thing is that I try and tie it back to things that people can understand. So when I did interval vectors, I didn't start by being like, oh, here's an interval vector, because people would be like, I have no reason to care about that, gone. Instead, what I did was sort of talk about, like, how do we tell, like, if we look at a scale, how do we say, oh, this is similar to this other scale? Like, how do you sort of see those bonds? And then you go, well, you could look at, say, how many half steps there are, and where those are, and how many half steps versus whole steps, because that's a common thing. And look at the interval of steps, and then we can sort of count down, okay, why don't we check the thirds too, and then sort of expand upwards from there until you get to, why don't we just like stop thinking about this as a scale, start thinking of it as a musical set, here's a bunch of numbers, but by that point, you're trapped. I've already got you, so I don't have to, I can get complicated, but start by trying to understand, start by trying to relate it as simply as possible to something that you expect your viewers to know, and then sort of work outwards from there. The other thing that I do sometimes when I don't have that is just start by showing them something cool. Like when I did a video on chromatic medians, I started by showing, like, here's an example of a hexatonic pole. I didn't use the word hexatonic pole. I didn't say it. I actually also screwed up the MIDI sample and played a chromatic median, a different one instead. But that was a mistake. That wasn't what I was trying to do. I started sort of being like, here's this thing. Check out this cool sound. Wow, doesn't that sound really cool and dramatic? Wait, what is it? What's going on? And then you can sort of rewind and then go into the sort of build up of like, well, let's talk about what median chords are, because if you don't start with that big, like, boom, here's a cool thing that we're gonna get to, then you run the risk of people being like, oh, I already know what medians are, so I'm leaving. And then they don't get to the really cool things further down because, you're not making a video about medians, you just need to cover that in order for chromatic medians to make sense, you know? So that'd be my two main approaches to those sorts of more esoteric, obscure topics.
All right, so it is 10 a.m., and so I'd ask two things. We'll thank Cory, and then please give your attention to Danny, who has an announcement. But first, Cory, thank you for your presentation.
I just wanted to let everybody know the box office is open, so you have a 20-minute break. If you want to wander to the back of the School of Music, to the Koger Center box office, it is open, okay? Thank you so much.